at 12:18 a.m. Yu Menglong's phone appeared inside one of Beijing's most elite residential compounds. Not in a police evidence locker. Not in his family's hands. But in the possession of someone else. It was not the location that disturbed investigators first. It was the timing. Just past midnight, when official offices were dark and records were meant to rest undisturbed, a single digital signal surfaced inside a luxury residential complex in Chaoyang district. The kind of place built by state-owned developers. The kind of place guarded by silence, not walls. In ordinary circumstances, a phone ping is meaningless. But this phone belonged to a man who was supposed to be gone. Yu Menglong had not vanished in chaos. There were no frantic searches. No official alerts. No public investigation that followed a normal disappearance. Instead, there was absence. Clean. Controlled. Almost rehearsed. For 3 years, his name faded from public view. His appearances stopped. His social footprint dissolved. Explanations emerged, but none were supported by records. Teaching in the mountains. Voluntary isolation. Personal choice. Each version sounded reasonable until placed next to a single, immovable fact. Yu Menglong was under full contractual control. His movements were never his own, which made the phone impossible. If this were a criminal case, the device should have been sealed, catalogued, and stored as evidence. If it were not a criminal case, it should have been returned to his family as a personal belonging. Yet on that night it appeared somewhere else entirely. In the hands of a third party with no public explanation. That is when the story stops being about disappearance and begins to resemble erasure. Because systems do not lose evidence by accident. Evidence is misplaced only when it threatens something larger than the truth. And here, more than data was missing. Location histories vanished from public security records. IP logs from critical periods were wiped clean. Not corrupted. Deleted. Selectively. We are trained to believe that power leaves traces. That influence is visible. That corruption is loud. But the most sophisticated systems operate quietly. They do not shout. They remove. As more fragments surfaced, fear followed close behind. Those who spoke publicly were threatened. Some were followed. Others were silenced by warning rather than force. It was not the behavior of a single offender. It was the pattern of protection. And still, no official explanation was offered. The deeper this case is examined, the clearer one conclusion becomes. Yu Menglong did not disappear into obscurity. He disappeared into structure, into a space where decisions are made without documentation, and outcomes are determined long before the public is allowed to ask questions. This is not a story about a missing celebrity. It is about a system that understands how to make a person vanish without ever admitting they were taken. Because once a system learns how to erase a person, it will never stop at just one. The first rule of any investigation is simple. Evidence follows custody. When that chain is broken, truth becomes negotiable. In the case of Yu Menglong, custody was never merely unclear. It was inverted. The object that should have anchored the timeline of his disappearance, his mobile phone, did not move from police hands to family. It moved sideways, quietly, into a private residence, shielded by status rather than law. What made this discovery especially alarming was not the identity of the person linked to the phone, but the context surrounding her. She was not a stranger who happened upon lost property. She existed within the same professional ecosystem that had managed Yu Menglong's career from the beginning. Media, production, contracts, control. In structured industries, proximity is never accidental. Public records revealed a familiar pattern. The same networks that shaped his public image also surrounded the object that carried his private data. Call logs, messages, locations. The intimate archive of a life that abruptly went dark. And yet, none of this material ever appeared in an official investigation. Instead, something else appeared. Absence. When independent reviewers attempted to trace the phone's historical location data, they encountered gaps where continuity should have existed. Entire periods were missing, not scrambled, not corrupted, removed with precision. The few remaining records pointed only to known residences in Beijing, as if the device had never traveled beyond approved boundaries. This raises a question that cannot be dismissed as speculation. Who has the authority to selectively erase data from public security systems? Ordinary officers do not. Private citizens cannot. Technical errors do not choose victims. What emerged was a pattern consistent with intervention. An operation conducted by individuals who understood both the system's architecture and its blind spots. The kind of knowledge that comes not from hacking, but from access. As these inconsistencies came to light, reactions followed a predictable curve. Silence from institutions. Denial through omission. And pressure applied to those who refused to let the issue rest. Whistleblowers described intimidation. Media workers reported surveillance. In at least one case, intimidation escalated beyond words. These responses were not spontaneous. They were coordinated. And coordination implies hierarchy. At this stage, it becomes necessary to address an uncomfortable reality. Not all investigations are designed to uncover truth. Some exist to contain it. When a case involves individuals whose influence extends into regulatory bodies, legal outcomes are no longer determined by evidence alone. They are managed. We have seen this before in other systems. Evidence disappears. Witnesses recant. Files are reclassified. Not because the facts are unclear, but because they are too clear. In Yu Menglong's case, the absence of an official criminal designation is itself revealing. Declaring a case criminal would have triggered procedural obligations. Evidence preservation. Family notification. Oversight. Each step would have created records. And records create accountability. By refusing to name the crime, the system avoided the process. The phone's appearance shattered that silence. Because objects do not lie. They only exist where they are placed. And when an object contradicts the narrative must be defended. Not by explanation, but by suppression. We must be precise here. This is not an accusation of individual guilt. It is an observation of structural behavior. Systems built to protect power respond predictably when challenged. They minimize exposure. They isolate risk. They sacrifice peripheral actors to preserve central stability. And sometimes they allow a person to disappear without acknowledging the act. Yu Menglong's case fits this pattern with disturbing accuracy. The disappearance, the erased data, the misplaced evidence, the intimidation of those who speak. Each element reinforces the same conclusion. This was not neglect. It was management. At this point, the question is no longer whether something happened to Yu Menglong. It is whether the truth was ever meant to surface at all. Because when evidence escapes containment, it threatens more than a single narrative. It threatens the integrity of the system that attempted to bury it. And systems, when threatened, do not react emotionally. They react decisively. And a process like this only exists when someone has already decided the outcome. Disappearance, when chosen, leaves traces of intent. Plans, farewells, financial footprints. Yu Menglong left none of these behind. The explanation offered to the public was simple and carefully reassuring. He had gone to a remote province to teach voluntarily. He had withdrawn from fame by choice. He had donated money. He had sought a quieter life. In isolation, each claim sounded plausible. Together, they collapsed under the weight of one undeniable fact. Yu Menglong was not free to make such decisions. As a contracted artist, his movements, schedules, and public presence were managed with precision. Contracts of this nature do not allow spontaneous disappearance. They are designed to prevent it. No artist under that level of control simply vanishes for 3 consecutive years without internal documentation, logistical coordination, and approval from multiple levels of management. Yet no such documentation was ever produced. What makes the explanation even more fragile is geography. Yu Menglong was said to have relocated to Yunnan, a region defined not only by its remoteness, but by its strategic isolation. Mountainous terrain, sparse infrastructure, limited oversight. Historically, regions like this have served a specific function within controlled systems. They are places where people can be moved out of sight without formally disappearing. During this period, China entered an era of strict lockdowns and movement control. Travel was restricted. Surveillance was heightened. Public activity was monitored with unprecedented intensity. Under such conditions, an unaccounted disappearance becomes even less believable. Systems that monitor everything do not suddenly fail to notice one person. They notice, and they decide how to classify the absence. Classifying it as voluntary solved multiple problems at once. But classification does not explain transformation. When Yu Menglong eventually reappeared, observers noted a change that could not be explained by time alone. His demeanor had shifted. The openness that once defined him was gone. In its place was restraint, hesitation, a careful economy of words. He appeared present, but not at ease, as though return had been negotiated, not granted. This is a familiar pattern to those who study coercive environments. Individuals subjected to prolonged control do not emerge broken in obvious ways. They emerge calibrated. They learn what not to say. They learn when silence is survival. They return carrying knowledge that cannot be shared. At this stage, another question must be asked. Why allow him to return at all? Systems that eliminate threats permanently do not reverse course. But systems that manage risk often do. Allowing a person to reappear under controlled conditions can serve several purposes. It reassures the public. It deflects suspicion. It transforms absence into closure without accountability. And it places the burden of silence on the survivor. During Yu Menglong's absence, rumors surfaced and were quietly neutralized. Speculation was redirected. Attention was fragmented. When information began to circulate that challenged the official narrative, it was framed as exaggeration or conspiracy. The goal was not to convince everyone. It was to exhaust inquiry. What is most telling is not what was said during these 3 years, but what was never addressed. There was no transparent timeline. No independent verification of his activities. No visual documentation. No third-party confirmation. Only statements repeated until familiarity replaced scrutiny. In investigative terms, this is not evidence. It is narrative management. And narrative management often accompanies something else. Containment. If Yu Menglong had been held, monitored, or restricted during this period, his value would not lie in his disappearance alone. It would lie in what he might have seen, what he might have learned, what he might have become aware of without permission. Knowledge in such systems is more dangerous than testimony, which leads to the most unsettling possibility. Yu Menglong was not erased because he was insignificant. He was controlled because he was adjacent to something that required silence. His return suggests that whatever he knew could be contained but not undone. Silence, then, was not imposed by force alone. It was negotiated through fear. At this point, the narrative of voluntary withdrawal fails entirely. What remains is a period of unaccounted time shaped by isolation, authority, and restraint. A gap filled not with freedom, but with compliance. And when a person returns from such a gap, they do not return whole. They return measured. If Yu Menglong was allowed back into public view, it was not because the danger had passed. It was because his silence had been assessed and deemed sufficient. If he was allowed to return, it was not because he was free. It was because his silence had value. There is a difference between coincidence and pattern. Coincidence comforts. Pattern accuses. When Yu Menglong returned to public view, the narrative shifted once again. This time, not toward our absence, but toward symbolism. Words repeated themselves across unrelated contexts. Images aligned too precisely to ignore. What had once been dismissed as rumor began to resemble rehearsal. One phrase in particular surfaced with unsettling consistency. A single shock gives birth to all things. It appeared first as a cryptic online message, posted years before Yu Menglong's disappearance reached public attention. At the time, it meant nothing. Or rather, it meant too little to provoke concern. But as events unfolded, the phrase refused to remain abstract. It re-emerged in connection with his final role. It echoed in dialogue. It framed moments that were later interpreted as endings. This is where the story becomes dangerous to oversimplify. To acknowledge symbolism is not to claim mysticism. Power does not require belief in the supernatural to function ritualistically. It requires repetition, control of narrative, timing, audience conditioning. Ritual in its most effective form is administrative. Yu Menglong's final public project was presented as a return, a restoration, a continuation. Yet viewers noted an atmosphere that felt out of place. Scenes associated with celebration carried the visual language of mourning. Floral arrangements resembled wreaths. Public ceremonies carried the tone of farewell rather than renewal. These details were dismissed individually. Together they formed a disturbing aesthetic coherence. What unsettled observers most was not the imagery itself, but the sense that it had been prepared in advance. In systems where individuals are managed as assets, endings are not spontaneous. They are framed, shaped, integrated into broader narratives that serve purposes beyond the individual. When a person becomes inconvenient, their removal is rarely abrupt. It is contextualized. Meaning is assigned. Closure is manufactured. This is what separates ordinary tragedy from symbolic elimination. The idea of a ritual does not require candles or chants. It requires a structure that converts a human life into a message, a warning, a demonstration of consequence. When power operates this way, death becomes communicative. It teaches silence. It reinforces hierarchy. It reminds others of their position. Within such systems, prophecy functions differently. It is not prediction. It is preparation. By allowing certain phrases, symbols, or expectations to circulate in advance, outcomes are normalized before they occur. When the event arrives, it feels inevitable rather than engineered. Yu Menglong's case reflects this logic with disturbing clarity. The phrase that once sounded poetic became terminal. The role that marked his return became his last. The public was given just enough information to feel informed, but never enough to understand. Those within the industry appeared unsurprised. Silence from peers was not accidental. It was survival. At no point did the system need to announce intent. It did not need to explain itself. It only needed to ensure that no alternative interpretation gained traction. This is why the most powerful acts of violence leave no visible wound. They leave narrative scars. They reshape what people believe is possible, acceptable, safe. To frame Yu Menglong's death as fate is to misunderstand the mechanics at work. Fate absolves responsibility. Systems prefer that. Systems thrive when outcomes appear cosmic rather than constructed. But what we see here is not destiny. It is design. When control reaches this level, the individual becomes secondary. What matters is the message carried by their disappearance, return, and final silence. The message is never spoken aloud, but it is understood. You can be removed. You can be rewritten. And your story can be used against those who remain. The most unsettling aspect of this case is not the question of who acted. It is the realization that the system functioned exactly as intended. Evidence was redirected. Time was erased. Meaning was assigned. And the audience was guided toward acceptance. The ritual was not performed in secrecy. It was performed in plain sight, under the protection of ambiguity. Because the most terrifying rituals are not performed in temples. They are performed in silence. The most terrifying rituals are not performed in temples. They are performed in silence. There are cases that end with arrests. There are cases that end with verdicts. And there are cases that end with silence. Yu Menglong's story belongs to the third category. By the time the public was allowed to look closely, the structure had already completed its work. Evidence had been displaced. Time had been fractured. Explanations had been repeated until they sounded familiar enough to pass as truth. What remained was not clarity, but exhaustion. And exhaustion is often mistaken for closure. It is tempting to search for a single culprit. A name. A face. A moment when everything went wrong. But this case resists such simplification. What unfolded here was not the failure of an individual, but the success of a system designed to operate without accountability. A system that understands how to remove a person without acknowledging the act and how to return them briefly to prove nothing happened at all. Yu Menglong's disappearance, return, and final silence form a sequence that cannot be understood in isolation. Each phase served a function. Absence created confusion. Return neutralized suspicion. Symbolism redirected attention. And silence ensured continuity. This is how erasure works when it is done correctly. The most dangerous aspect of such cases is not the loss of one life, but the precedent they establish. When a system demonstrates that it can rewrite reality without consequence, it teaches others to adapt, to remain quiet, to interpret warning signs correctly, to survive. And survival in these environments often requires forgetting. We are not presented with proof beyond doubt. We are presented with alignment. with patterns that repeat across unrelated details, with inconsistencies that lean in the same direction, with fear that surfaces not where guilt is loud, but where power is protected. In investigative work, certainty is rare. But probability speaks. And the probability here is that Yu Menglong did not simply fade away. He was processed, managed, contained. His story was not lost. It was redirected. This does not require belief in fate or ritual. It requires recognition of how modern systems convert human lives into variables, assets, risks, messages. When that conversion is complete, morality becomes secondary to stability. What remains then is not an answer, but a warning. If one person can vanish without explanation, return without freedom, and exit without acknowledgement, the mechanism that allowed it is still active. It does not need to repeat the act immediately. It only needs to be remembered. Because forgetting is not passive. It is the final step of every successful crime. And when forgetting becomes routine, disappearance becomes policy. Yu Menglong's name may one day be replaced by another. The circumstances may differ. The narrative may change. But the structure will remain the same, waiting for the moment it is needed again. The question is no longer what happened to him. The question is how many times this can happen before silence stops being an outcome and becomes an expectation. Because forgetting is the final step of every successful crime.